Howdy. How's it going, Chess College? Week 3, Humanities 4 through Film Studies. They used to call them motion pictures. Then Then they started calling them films because it sounded more artistic. They still call them films, but they don't shoot on film anymore. It's all hard drives. What do you call that? It's not too romantic. My new hard drive, epic. Doesn't sound as good as film. Anyway, hope you guys are doing well. It's only 100 here today. It's getting cooler. We call that a cooling trend here in Reading. If it's 100 degrees, all is well. Hope you guys are hanging in there. You're working on hard on those papers. Get them in there. Don't wait till the last minute to watch that movie because it's a difficult movie to watch and to try to fully understand. Hopefully, it works out. And I think for some reason my video is sketchy and weird, so pardon me. It seems to be flickering all over the place. You know how we are, victims of technology. Anyway, this week is week 3. We're coming out of the silent era films into sound, which changes everything. It changes everything for a couple years, not a good way. People were used to moving the camera, telling their actors what to do with the camera running because there's nobody recording sound. All that changed with sound. They had to put cameras in these big blimps because the cameras are really noisy. They had to build sound studios. Never had those before. Big airplane hangar studios. Maybe you've been to LA. They got them down there. Warner Brothers. They all have them at one time. It's Columbia, 20th Century Fox, Paramount. All had these huge airplane hangar buildings with padding inside. And they had to keep the outside noise out. That's why you see very few films in the 1930s, this era we're going to talk about today, filmed outside in real locations. It was too noisy. And you couldn't record dialogue. You couldn't record things out there without having all this interference. So they shut everything off into these very theatrical sets. It was hard for them to move the camera because these cameras were huge and they weren't easy to move anyway like they are now. And so everything was for the sound. And so for first early sound movies, the visual medium fell off big time. And a lot of directors who worked in the silent films, so many of them, from Fritz Lang to Charlie Chaplin, didn't really want to work on the sound because they felt it wasn't as creative. It was no longer motion pictures. It was talkie, what they call talkies. People talk nonstop, just like they do today on TV. They just never shut up. That's the new medium. It became a written word medium instead of a visual medium. Went from motion pictures to what they call talkies. Early talkie films, the actors couldn't move much because they had to have the microphone in one place, and they referred to it as flower pot acting because usually there's a scene between two people sitting at a table, and there'll be a flower pot there in between them, and that's where the microphone is. And the actors have to be talking into the flower pot. So it makes for some stiff performances. A lot of silent screen star actors didn't make the transition to sound. And it wasn't necessarily because they had bad voices. Who's got a good voice now? Do you actually think Johnny Depp has a good speaking voice? He mumbles. Does Brad Pitt have a great voice? No. They look great, but that's about it. No, it wasn't the sound of their voices. It was a lot of it was bad acting. When you speak, you better speak in a naturalistic way. And if you don't, you're not going to make it in movies. That's not an easy thing to do, folks. Speak like a naturalistic way. We'll be talking about method acting later, where we break down the barriers of naturalistic acting compared to realism and compared to theatrical acting. There's a big difference, but not yet. We're coming out of the silent era because people now don't want to ever see another silent film. Once they got a taste of a movie with talking language, the first one was the Jazz Singer, and that's not totally sound. It's a lot of elements of that are silent. But he sings. Al Jolson sings, and other elements are silence, because it was a new medium and they didn't know what to do with it yet. It was so new that they thought having sound would be a novelty, but they didn't know it was going to be a revolution. And then eventually, the cameras got the recorders got smaller. They got more portable. They could move them around. Cameras got quieter, and things changed again, but not yet. So, in 1930s, what's happening? Well, in politics, what's happening is we're in a depression. Wall Street crashed in 29. People committed suicide because they lost their fortunes. And for the next 10 years, almost 10 years, the United States of America was in the Great Depression. What that entailed was joblessness, homelessness, except for they didn't call it homelessness like we do now. Um, People couldn't pay their rents. They got evicted. People couldn't find jobs. They had to eat in soup kitchens. This was all over the United States. Now, how is Hollywood going to survive? They still cost a nickel or a dime to go to a movie. That's a lot of money in those days. And Hollywood's got to survive somehow. They got to keep putting sell the tickets, sell the popcorn, sell the soft drinks. That has to happen for them to make some kind of profit. So they made movies according to what they figured the audience wanted to see. And what they wanted to see was feel good movies, musicals with Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers. We could see these fantasy storybook fairy tale movies about wealthy people dancing the night away with beautiful costumes, beautiful music, and it made us feel better about ourselves watching it. Then we had to go outside where the reality was and didn't feel so good. So musicals were a great escapism. Then there was gangster films. The rise of the gangster film uh, was in this era. And where did that come from? Well, that came from Prohibition. Remember in the 1920s to 1930 or so, booze was illegal in this country. That gave rise to gangsterism, who were making booze and selling it illegal. Huge $1 million trade. Well, the American people became fascinated with gangsters and they started making movies. Public Enemy, Roaring Twenties, Little Caesar were all made in the early 30s to show gangsterism for the first time. Now, these are white gangsters, usually Irish Americans living in the slums of New York or Chicago, and they're trying to accomplish the American dream through selling booze illegally and having run ins with the law, killing people. So there's lots of violence, lots of action. And it was a world we were fascinated with watching. And those movies are great. They're totally fascinating to watch. But before that, we didn't have gangsters. This is a phenomenon brought along through the culture. And I'll be talking a lot about the culture in this course because everything that's going on in the culture is reflected in the movies and vice versa. And so right now, the Roaring Twenties reflected that good times. People are having a good time, and the movies reflected that. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And then in the 1930s, the Great Depression, people still needed an outlet. Go to a movie for 2 hours, feel good for 2 hours, escape reality for 2 hours. But in those days, you could go in there all day if you wanted to, and some people did. They didn't kick you out after every screening like they do now. And a dime or a nickel will get you in there. You can stay in the theater all day and watch escapism. Another genre, these are all called genres now. The genre that was another popular genre was screwball comedies. We would call them rom coms now, romantic comedies. And you know who stars in all those? Adam Sandler and Sandra Bullock, all the same people. Um, these early screwball comedies were something that hadn't been seen before. And if you look at a movie, you might have to watch it, might write a paper about it this week. It Happened One Night. Frank Capra's great revolutionary 1934 movie with Clark Gable, Claudette Colbert. This is before they were big stars. You probably didn't even know who they are, but they got to be huge stars eventually. Clark Gable starred in Gone with the Wind. That's all I need to say. That was like the Star Wars of its day. Anyway, maybe you've heard of it. Maybe great grandparents have heard of it. But anyway, this is them as young people, and it's all set in the Depression. It's actually filmed on location, which was really rare. A talkie, very smart script. Frank Capra was the director, and he was considered sort of the Steve Spielberg of his day. He made very popular films that the masses adored and loved, just like Steve Spielberg. So they weren't too challenging. They weren't depressing or brutal. They were feel good movies, and this screwball comedy began with this movie. And there was a whole slew of them in the 30s, from Bringing Up Baby to Philadelphia Story to Our Man Godfrey, which spawned a whole genre of what they referred to as screwball comedies, another way of escapism. And a lot of times these screwball comedies made fun of rich people, and that went over well with the audience who were not rich. They like seeing the rich get their comeuppance, and even though in real life that probably didn't happen, but in the movies it did, because movies are all fantasy. They're fairy tales. They're not real, folks. Although they give you a lot of truth, they do. Another genre that became very popular in the 1930s was, I'm not going to say horror movies because they're literally monster movies. Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, Wolfman, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. These were all hugely influential early horror films in the 1930s in America coming out of Hollywood. The reason why they were so popular is a political and cultural reason. Hitler in Germany was coming into power in the early 30s. He was getting really powerful. He was banging the war drums. He was banging the drums of being a Jew as being a bad thing, blaming the Jews on all their woes, the world's woes. So it was aimed after um, a race of people and his hatred for them. And as you well know, what happened in World War II, he tried to exterminate the entire Jewish race. That's right, folks. Anyway, so our president at the time didn't want to, Congress didn't want to go to another war or even get in confrontation with this guy. As long as he stayed over there and didn't bother us, we were okay with that. We'd come through World War I, where they fought Germany, we beat them. We didn't want to do another war. And so we stayed out of all this. But Hitler started to invade different countries, Poland, France. He started pushing people around. He invaded Africa. And these countries were begging us for help, but our Congress said no. Hitler started eventually bombing England and London. This would be 39 or 40, 2 years before he got into the war. And England asked us for help many times. And Franklin Roosevelt, who was our president, wanted to help, but Congress said, nope, we're not going to give you the authority. We're not going to give you the funds to help our allies. And by now, Italy was in the war. Russia was getting into the war against Hitler, but not us. But we could go to war with a monster in the movies. We could go to war with Frankenstein's monster. By the way, that's what he's called. He doesn't have a name. It's not Frankenstein. Frankenstein is the doctor who created this man, 7-foot tall monster, out of dead parts. And very influential movie, Frankenstein. And The Bride of Frankenstein is actually a better movie. where Dr. Frankenstein makes the monster a wife because he's lonely. He wants a partner, and a regular human woman's not going to get near this dude. And the sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, directed by the same director, he brought this a dead woman with different body parts back to life. And guess what, folks? She rejects the monster. And that sends him on a rampage, a killing rampage. See, even the monster gets rejected by another monster. Can you imagine? Anyway, very creative film, very popular. And in these movies, like Wolfman, who turns into a werewolf every full moon, goes on a killing spree. You have to kill him with a silver bullet. Dracula, who's sucking people's blood in the middle of the night, you had to stake him through the heart if you could find him. The mummy was a mummy from ancient Egypt who comes alive. There's Invisible Man, too. Claude Rains played that part. He took a potion, he became invisible. So, what do you do when you're invisible? You do evil things, evidently. You kill people, you rape women, and you become a monster. How do you kill an invisible man if you can't see him? Well, you got to watch the movie. So, in the movies, we could actually fight these monsters and we could destroy them, but not the monster that was happening in Germany with the rise of Nazism. We could beat them in the movies, but we couldn't do anything about it in real life. And during this time of Hitler's rising, comic books became one of the few places where they confronted Hitler. Superman, they were called Action Comics, he's fighting the Third Reich in the early Supermans. And if, by the way, if you happen to have a Superman from 1937, it's probably worth $2-3 million, so I'd hold on to it. Superman was fighting the Nazis along about 1939 or thereabouts. Wonder Woman, you've seen the movies, you've seen the TV show. Wonder Woman was fighting Nazis. So we could fight the Nazis in comic books, and we could fight movie monsters, but we were not allowed to fight the real monster that was rearing his ugly head across the pond. We thought we got the ocean between us, we're safe. Yeah, that didn't work out when Japan bombed us at Pearl Harbor, 1941, declared war on us. Germany was their ally. They declared war on us, and then that's when we finally got into the war. They brought the war to us first, and then we took the war back to them. And you know what happened there? I'll be talking about that next week when we get into the decade of 1940s. This week is the 1930s. Enjoy what you this week. I'll post some samples for these movies. You will write a paper about one of these 1930s movies. It'll be either a screwball comedy or gangster film, or maybe I'll give you a choice. I want to sign that probably till Wednesday, so don't worry about it. Get your paper in. I think it's due tomorrow night. Please get it in. If it's late, don't hand it in. Unless you have a real good excuse, you have to explain it to me, because you've had plenty of time to watch that movie and write your first paper, and just jump in. That's the best way to do it. Just jump in and go for it. Give it your best shot. What else do I have on this thing here? Oh yeah, I wanted to run over this real quick, and I'll shut up. In your textbook, you should read chapter 3 on page 64. Learning objectives. Chapter 3 is real important. After reading this chapter, you should be able to explain how and why movies are classified. Why is a genre? Why are they classified into feature films, narrative films, documentary films? A narrative is simply a story. That's all that means, a narrative. Documentary, you know what that is, right? We'll be talking about those later. Those are films that are not fiction films. You'll be able to define narrative. You'll be able to define experimental. We'll talk about this later. Documentary. You'll be able to discuss the characteristics in experimental films. Not very many of those were being made during this time. Understand the importance of genre. It's just a category. It's a fancy word. It's a French word for category. Um, what defines the six major American genres featured in this chapter? You have to read the chapter to get all that, but I can tell you the genres: Western, horror, my fingers are up here, sci-fi, rom-coms. Uh, talk about animation a bit too. During this era, animation, Walt Disney was starting to get his first successful animation films that were starting to happen in the 30s. I want to talk about that. I'm going to have a whole section on animation, but not this week. You'll be able to talk about this stuff intelligently if you read your book, and you'll be able to help write your papers because knowing that stuff in the text will help you write your paper. Anyway, I'll shut up now. More to come this week. Look for your next paper assignment, and I'll see you in a couple of days where the story film continues.